The call came on a Tuesday morning. At first, Richard Bennett almost ignored it. He was standing in his corner office on the 34th floor, staring at the skyline of Chicago, reviewing numbers that would determine the biggest deal of his career. The phone rang again. When he finally answered, everything changed. "Mr. Bennett?" a woman's voice asked. "Speaking." There was a pause. "I'm calling from St. Mary's Hospital." Richard frowned. Hospitals called people every day. It was probably a billing issue. Maybe insurance paperwork. Then the woman spoke again. "Your wife has been admitted after collapsing at home." The folder slipped from Richard's hand. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. "What happened?" he asked. "We believe it was a stroke." The room suddenly felt smaller. His wife Susan was only 61. Healthy. Active. The kind of woman who still walked every morning and remembered everyone's birthday. "A stroke?" "No," Richard whispered. But the woman continued speaking. "You should come as soon as possible." The line went dead. For several seconds, Richard stood frozen. Then he grabbed his coat and rushed toward the elevator. As the doors closed, his reflection stared back at him. Gray hair. Expensive suit. A luxury watch worth more than his first car. At 63 years old, Richard had everything he once dreamed about. A successful company. A beautiful home. Money. Respect. Awards. People admired him. Some even envied him. But as the elevator descended, a terrifying question appeared in his mind. When was the last time he had actually sat down and talked with Susan? Not about bills. Not about schedules. Not about work. Just talked. He couldn't remember. And that scared him more than the hospital call. The drive felt endless. Traffic lights turned red. Cars moved too slowly. Every minute felt stolen. As Richard gripped the steering wheel, memories began surfacing. Not recent memories. Old ones. The kind buried beneath decades of busyness. He remembered meeting Susan when they were both 22. Back then, he had nothing. No money. No business. No fancy office. Just dreams. Huge dreams. He wanted success more than anything. And Susan believed in him. When others doubted him, she encouraged him. When his first business failed, she stayed. When they struggled to pay rent, she worked extra shifts. When their son Michael was born, she practically raised him alone while Richard worked 14-hour days. Back then, Richard promised himself it would all be worth it. Just a few years of sacrifice. Then life would get easier. Then he'd spend more time with family. Then he'd slow down. Then he'd be present. But the years kept passing. And then never came. There was always another promotion. Another client. Another deal. Another goal. Another excuse. The hospital finally appeared ahead. Richard parked and ran inside. His heart pounded as he approached the front desk. "Richard Bennett," he said breathlessly. "They called about my wife." The receptionist directed him upstairs. Moments later, he entered a quiet room. Susan lay motionless in the hospital bed. Machines beeped softly. An IV ran into her arm. Her eyes were closed. Richard stopped in the doorway. For the first time in decades, he didn't know what to do. The woman lying there had shared his entire adult life. 41 years of marriage. And suddenly she looked fragile. Small. Human. Not the unstoppable force who always kept everything together. A doctor entered the room. Richard listened as he explained the situation. The stroke wasn't fatal. That was the good news. But recovery would take time. Possibly months. Maybe longer. There could be permanent effects. No guarantees. Richard nodded mechanically. His mind struggled to absorb the words. After the doctor left, silence filled the room. Richard sat beside Susan. For hours. Watching. Waiting. Thinking. Then his eyes landed on something resting on the bedside table. A notebook. Old. Worn. Blue cover. He recognized it immediately. Susan had carried that notebook for years. She wrote in it constantly. Thoughts. Memories. Plans. Richard had never paid much attention. Now curiosity pulled him toward it. Slowly, he reached for the notebook. Part of him felt guilty. Part of him felt desperate. He opened the first page, and what he found inside made his stomach drop. Written neatly across the top was a title. Things I Wish Richard Had Time to See. Below it was a list. Dozens of entries. Years of entries. Moments. Memories. Events. Conversations that never happened. family milestones he missed, dreams she never shared because he was always too busy. Richard stared at the pages. His hands began to shake, and as he turned to the next entry, he discovered something that would force him to question the last 30 years of his life. Richard stared at the notebook for a long time before turning the page. The room was silent, except for the steady beeping of the monitor beside Susan's bed. His wife remained asleep, unaware that, for the first time in decades, her husband was paying attention. The first entry was dated 29 years earlier. Richard swallowed hard. That was around the time his company had finally begun to succeed. Back then, he remembered feeling proud, victorious, certain he was building a better future for his family. But Susan's words told a very different story. Michael rode his bike, without training wheels today. Below it, she had written, he kept looking down the street, hoping his dad would come home, before sunset, so he could show him. He waited until it got dark. Richard closed his eyes. He remembered that day. Or at least, he remembered where he was. A conference room. A major client meeting. The contract had been worth thousands. At the time, it felt important. Now he couldn't remember the client's name, but he could picture his young son waiting at the curb. Waiting for him. The next entry was only 3 months later. Michael scored the winning basket. Another note followed. After the game, he searched every row of the bleachers, looking for Richard. Richard's chest tightened. He vaguely remembered Susan mentioning a basketball game. He had promised to attend. Then something came up. Something urgent. Something that probably didn't matter anymore. The notebook continued. Year after year, page after page, a record of moments he never witnessed. Birthdays, school plays, graduations, family dinners, vacations, ordinary days, the very things that had quietly become a life. And somehow, he had missed most of them. Several hours later, Richard left the hospital cafeteria, carrying a cup of coffee he didn't want. His mind felt numb. He sat near a window and stared outside. Around him, families moved through the halls. Some worried, some laughing, some simply spending time together. And for the first time, Richard noticed something. None of them cared about stock prices. None of them were discussing quarterly reports. Nobody was talking about promotions. They were talking about people, about love, about being there. The realization hit him like a punch. For 30 years, he had measured life by achievements. But sitting in that hospital, achievements felt strangely small. His phone buzzed. An email. Then another. Then 3 more. Work. Always work. Without thinking, Richard opened one. A client needed an answer. An executive wanted approval. An investor had questions. The familiar pressure immediately returned. For decades, this had been his normal, his addiction, his identity. But before he could reply, another message appeared. This one was from Michael, his son. Richard stared at it. The relationship between them had always been polite, respectful, but distant, like two people connected by blood rather than friendship. The message was short. How's mom? Nothing else. No, how are you? No warmth. No conversation. Just concern for Susan. Richard typed a response. Stable. Doctors are hopeful. A few minutes later, Michael replied. Good. That was it. The conversation ended. And somehow, that hurt more than Richard expected. Because he suddenly realized something painful. He barely knew his own son. That evening, Richard returned to Susan's room. The notebook waited beside her bed. He picked it up again. This time, he turned toward the middle. The entries became more emotional as the years passed. One page stopped him cold. It was written 15 years earlier. Richard promised we'd take that trip to Maine after he finished the project. Below it, the project ended. Another one started. A few pages later, Michael leaves for college tomorrow. Richard says he'll try to make breakfast with us. Then, he got called into the office at 5 a.m. Richard felt sick. The memories were flooding back now. Not because he remembered attending these moments. Because he remembered missing them. Every absence had seemed temporary, necessary, responsible. He had convinced himself he was doing it for them, providing, protecting, building security. But sitting beside Susan's hospital bed, a disturbing question formed in his mind. What if the people he loved never wanted the things he spent his life chasing. What if they simply wanted him? Near midnight, Susan stirred. Richard immediately sat forward. Her eyes opened slightly. Confused. Weak. But awake. "Richard?" she whispered. His throat tightened. "I'm here." A faint smile appeared on her face. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Susan looked around the room. "You're not at work?" The question shattered him. Not because she meant it cruelly. Because she genuinely sounded surprised. As if seeing her husband beside her was unusual. As if she had spent so many years alone that his presence felt unexpected. Richard reached for her hand. "I took some time off." Susan nodded weakly. Then she drifted back to sleep. But her question remained trapped inside his mind. "You're not at work?" A wife recovering from a stroke expected her husband to be somewhere else. That wasn't normal. That was a verdict. A judgment delivered by decades of absence. Richard sat there long after midnight, unable to escape the truth. Then he opened the notebook one more time. Near the back, he found an envelope taped inside. His name was written across the front. Only 2 words. For Richard. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. A letter Susan had never given him. And after reading the first sentence, Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Richard stared at the envelope for several seconds before unfolding the letter. His hands trembled. The paper was worn, as if it had been opened and reread many times. He looked towards Susan. She was asleep again, peaceful, unaware that 30 years of buried truth was about to reach him all at once. Richard took a slow breath and began reading. "Dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means one of 2 things. Either I finally found the courage to give it to you, or life decided for me." A chill ran through him. He continued. "I don't blame you for working hard. I know why you did it. I know where you came from. I know how badly you wanted to give us a better life." Richard felt his eyes sting. Susan had always understood him better than anyone. Even now. Especially now. But the next paragraph hit harder. "What hurts isn't that you worked. What hurts is that somewhere along the way, you stopped coming home." Richard froze. Stopped coming home. The words echoed through his mind. Of course he came home. Every night. Most nights anyway. Didn't he? Then he realized what she meant. His body came home. His attention didn't. His mind stayed at the office. At meetings. At future goals. At problems that needed solving. Even when he sat at the dinner table, part of him was somewhere else. Even when he attended family events, he was checking emails. Even when he listened, he wasn't really hearing. For years, he had been physically present and emotionally absent. Susan's letter continued. "Sometimes I miss the young man who had nothing. Not because life was easier, but because back then, I felt like I mattered more than your schedule." Richard covered his face. A painful memory surfaced. 25 years earlier, a rainy Saturday, Susan had planned a family picnic for weeks. At the last minute, Richard cancelled. A client emergency. He remembered her smile fading. At the time, he thought she understood. Now he wondered how many times she had quietly swallowed disappointment. How many times she had smiled while hurting. How many times she chose not to complain because she loved him. Richard stopped reading. His chest felt heavy. The truth was becoming impossible to avoid. He had spent decades believing he was sacrificing for his family. But nobody had asked him to sacrifice the relationship itself. Nobody had asked him to miss everything. Those were choices. His choices. And now there was no way to undo them. He looked around the hospital room. The machines. The white walls. The silence. Suddenly, all the money in the world seemed useless. He would have traded every award, every bonus, every business victory, just to go back and attend one missed birthday, one basketball game, one family vacation, one ordinary dinner. But life didn't offer refunds. The next morning, Michael arrived. Richard heard footsteps outside the room. Then his son appeared in the doorway. 40 years old now. Tall. Successful. A father himself. For a moment, Richard barely recognized him. Not because Michael had changed. Because Richard hadn't paid enough attention while he was growing up. Michael walked directly to Susan. "Hey, Mom." His voice softened immediately. He kissed her forehead, held her hand, asked questions, checked on her condition. Richard watched quietly, feeling strangely like an outsider. Eventually Michael turned toward him. "How are the doctors feeling?" Richard answered. They discussed treatment, recovery, therapy. The conversation remained polite, careful, almost professional, like co-workers discussing a project, not father and son. The silence that followed felt uncomfortable. Finally, Richard spoke. "Michael." His son looked up. Richard hesitated. 1,000 things wanted to come out. Apologies, regrets, questions. Instead, he asked something simple. "How are the kids?" Michael seemed surprised. "The kids are good. How old are they now?" The moment the words left Richard's mouth, he regretted them. Michael's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. Enough to reveal the damage. "You mean your grandchildren?" Richard felt heat rise in his face. Of course. His grandchildren. The children he rarely visited. The birthdays he sometimes missed. The soccer games he never attended. History repeating itself. Michael answered quietly. "Ethan is 12. Lily turned 9 last month." Last month. Richard hadn't even remembered. A painful silence settled between them. Then Michael looked away. Not angry, not cruel, just tired, as if disappointment had exhausted him years ago. That afternoon, after Michael left, Richard sat alone in the hospital cafeteria. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about work. He wasn't thinking about money. He wasn't planning the future. He was looking backward. And he didn't like what he saw. A life filled with accomplishments. And relationships filled with empty spaces. Then his phone rang. It was the chairman of his company. Richard answered automatically. The voice on the other end sounded urgent. A major problem had emerged. The biggest deal of the year was in jeopardy. Investors were demanding answers. Executives needed leadership. They needed him. The old Richard immediately recognized the feeling. Responsibility. Importance. The rush of being needed. For 30 years, he would have left the hospital without hesitation. He would have convinced himself family understood. He would have promised to make it up later. But as the chairman continued speaking, Richard looked through the cafeteria window. He thought about Susan, Michael, his grandchildren, the notebook, the letter, the years that were already gone. Then he realized something terrifying. If he kept choosing work, there might not be enough time left to fix what mattered. The chairman finished speaking. "Richard, can you be here within an hour?" Richard stared at the phone. 30 years of habits pulling him one direction. His family pulling him another. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure which choice he would make. Then he opened his mouth to answer. And the words that came out shocked even him. Richard sat in the hospital cafeteria, phone pressed against his ear. On the other end, the chairman was waiting. "So?" he asked. "Can you get here within an hour?" For 30 years, Richard would have answered without thinking. Of course, that had always been the answer. Work came first. The company needed him. The deal needed him. The future needed him. That was the story he had told himself for decades. But now, something felt different. Richard looked through the cafeteria window. A young father was helping his little daughter walk across the parking lot. The girl held his hand tightly, laughing, talking, completely unaware that one day she would grow up and remember moments exactly like this. Not the money her father earned, not the meetings he attended, the moments, the presence, the feeling of being important to someone. Richard closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he finally answered. "No." The chairman was silent. "What do you mean, no?" "I'm not coming." Another silence. Longer this time. Then a nervous laugh. "Richard, this isn't the time for jokes." "I'm not joking." The words surprised even him. After all these years, saying no felt almost unnatural, like learning a new language. The chairman's voice became serious. "This deal affects hundreds of employees. I know. Investors are expecting answers. I know." "Then what are you doing?" Richard stared at the floor. For the first time in his career, he answered honestly. "I'm sitting beside my wife." The chairman didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "Richard, you've never missed something this important." Richard looked toward the hospital corridor. "No," he said quietly. "I've missed more important things." And then he ended the call. For several minutes he sat there, heart pounding, half expecting panic to hit him. But it didn't. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar. Relief. A small, fragile relief. like he had finally stopped carrying a weight he didn't realize was crushing him. When he returned to Susan's room, she was awake. Her eyes followed him as he entered. "You look different," she said weakly. Richard smiled. "I do?" Susan nodded. Something happened. For a moment he considered telling her everything. The notebook, the letter, the regret, the guilt. Instead, he simply sat beside her. "I stayed." "What?" "The company called." Susan immediately understood. Decades of marriage had taught her exactly what that meant. "And?" "I stayed." She looked at him for several seconds. Then something happened that broke his heart. Tears filled her eyes. Not because she was sad, because she was surprised. As if the gesture was so unusual that it felt extraordinary. Richard squeezed her hand and silently hated the man he had been. Over the next few days, Susan slowly improved. The doctors remained optimistic. Recovery would take time, but progress was visible. For the first time in years, Richard cleared his schedule. No meetings, no conference calls, no endless emails. Just Susan. At first, he didn't know what to do with himself. His entire identity had revolved around work. Without it, he felt strangely lost. Then he started listening. Really listening. To Susan, to the nurses, to other families, to the world around him. And the more he listened, the more he realized how much he had missed. One afternoon, Susan asked him a simple question. "Do you remember our trip to Maine?" Richard smiled. "Of course." But Susan laughed softly. "No, you don't." The words stung because they were true. He remembered booking the trip. He remembered canceling it. He remembered promising they would go later. But he didn't remember the details because the trip never happened. Susan stared out the window. "I always wanted to see the lighthouse at Portland Head." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. One small dream. One simple wish. And somehow 30 years had passed without it happening. A week later, Susan was strong enough to walk short distances. That same afternoon, Richard received another call. This time from the company's board. The situation was serious. Very serious. The deal had collapsed. Stock prices were falling. Several executives were blaming Richard's absence. The board wanted an emergency meeting. Immediately, as the call ended, Richard sat quietly. The old fear returned. What if everything he built fell apart? What if his legacy was destroyed? What if decades of work vanished? Then another thought appeared. What if it already had? Because what was the point of building an empire if there was nobody left to share it with? That evening, Michael stopped by the hospital. Susan was sleeping. Richard and his son found themselves alone in the hallway. For several awkward moments, neither spoke. Then Richard decided to take a risk. "Want to grab a coffee?" Michael looked surprised. "Now?" "Yeah." His son hesitated, as if evaluating whether this invitation was real. Eventually, he nodded. A few minutes later, they sat across from each other in a small hospital cafe. The silence felt uncomfortable. Years of distance sat between them. Finally, Richard spoke. "Michael." His son looked up. Richard took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air. Michael didn't respond. He simply waited. Richard had spent years avoiding this conversation. Now there was nowhere left to hide. "I missed a lot," Richard said quietly. "A lot more than I should have." Michael stared into his coffee, still silent. Then, after several seconds, he asked a question Richard wasn't prepared for. A question that cut deeper than any accusation. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Richard felt his stomach tighten. Slowly, he shook his head. Michael looked directly at him, and what he said next would force Richard to confront the most painful truth of all. Richard sat frozen. The hospital cafe suddenly felt too quiet, too small. Across the table, Michael stared into his coffee. Not angry, not emotional, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying disappointment for a very long time. Richard swallowed. "Tell me." Michael nodded slowly. Then he spoke. "You know what hurt the most?" Richard waited. It wasn't the missed games. A knot tightened in Richard's chest. It wasn't the birthdays. Michael looked up. It wasn't even the school events. Richard frowned slightly. For years he had assumed those were the wounds. The obvious absences. The missed moments. But Michael shook his head. Kids understand when parents are busy. Richard listened carefully. "What hurt was believing I wasn't important enough." The words landed like a punch. Michael continued, "I knew you loved us." His voice remained calm. "I never doubted that." A small sense of relief appeared inside Richard. Then Michael finished the sentence. "But I always felt like we came after everything else." The relief vanished. "You'd miss dinner because of work." Michael looked away. "You'd miss vacations because of work." Another pause. "You'd miss birthdays because of work." Richard couldn't speak. "And eventually," Michael said quietly, "I stopped expecting you." The sentence shattered something inside him, because he knew exactly what Michael meant. Children wait, then they hope, then they make excuses, then eventually they stop expecting. And once that happens, something changes forever. Richard stared at the table. His eyes burned. For decades he had believed his family understood, that they appreciated the sacrifices, that one day they would see everything he had done for them. But Michael wasn't describing appreciation. He was describing loneliness. A loneliness Richard had unknowingly created. Michael leaned back. "I remember one birthday." Richard looked up. "I think I was 10. Michael smiled sadly. "Mom told me you were definitely coming." Richard already knew where the story was going, because suddenly he remembered the day. A major client, an important dinner, a huge opportunity. Michael continued. "I sat by the window for 2 hours. Richard closed his eyes. The memory hit with painful clarity. "I kept telling everyone you'd be there." Silence. When Mom finally cut the cake, she tried to act happy. Michael laughed softly, but I could tell she was disappointed too. Richard felt tears gathering. "I waited until everyone left before opening presents." His voice cracked, "because a part of me still thought you might walk through the door." The cafe disappeared around Richard. All he could see was a 10-year-old boy sitting beside a birthday cake, waiting, believing, hoping, and all Richard could see was the man he had been. A man sitting in some restaurant discussing business while his son waited for him. A deal he couldn't even remember. A birthday his son never forgot. They sat quietly for several minutes. Then Michael surprised him. "I don't tell you this because I'm angry." Richard looked up. "I'm telling you because I don't want you making the same mistake with Ethan and Lily, his grandchildren." The name suddenly felt heavier, more real. Michael shook his head. "They adore you." Richard felt a spark of hope. "Really?" Michael nodded. "Yeah." Then he added something heartbreaking. "They still think you'll show up." Richard couldn't breathe. Still think. Meaning, there was still time. Not much, but some. Enough to change something. Enough to become someone different. If he acted now. That night, Richard returned to Susan's room. She was awake, reading, the notebook resting in her lap. When she saw his expression, she immediately knew something had happened. "Talk to me." Richard sat beside her. For the first time in decades, he didn't hold anything back. He told her about the conversation, the birthday story, the waiting, the disappointment, the guilt, everything. Susan listened quietly. Then she reached for his hand. "You can't change the past." Richard stared at the floor. "I know. But you can still change the ending." The words stayed with him. Change the ending. Not erase the story. Not rewrite history. But change what came next. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all any of us ever get. 3 days later, Susan was discharged. The doctors were pleased. Recovery would continue at home. As Richard pushed her wheelchair through the hospital entrance, sunlight warmed their faces. For the first time in years, neither of them seemed in a hurry. Life had forced them to stop. And somehow, stopping had allowed them to see. When they reached the parking lot, Richard's phone buzzed again. Another board member. Another crisis. Another emergency. He stared at the screen, then switched the phone off completely. Susan looked at him. "Are you sure?" Richard smiled. "No," she laughed. "Good answer." A week later, Richard made a decision that shocked everyone. The board, the executives, even himself. After 30 years leading the company, he announced he was stepping down. Not immediately, but soon. The reaction was immediate. People called him crazy. Some said he was making an emotional decision. Others warned he would regret it. Maybe they were right. Maybe they weren't. But for the first time in his life, Richard wasn't asking what would grow his business. He was asking what would grow the life he had left. And as the news spread through the company, one person appeared at his front door unexpectedly. A person Richard hadn't seen in nearly 5 years. When he opened the door, his heart nearly stopped. Standing there were Ethan and Lily, his grandchildren, and the look on Ethan's face told Richard this visit wasn't just a surprise. It was a test. One that would determine whether the old Richard was truly gone. Richard opened the front door and stared. Ethan stood there, taller than he remembered, 12 years old. Dark hair, serious eyes. Beside him was Lily, 9 years old, clutching a small backpack and smiling nervously. Behind them stood Michael. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Lily broke the silence. "Grandpa." She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around him. Richard almost lost his balance. Not because of her weight, because of the emotion that hit him. He slowly hugged her back, holding on a little longer than necessary, as if making up for years of distance. When he looked up, Ethan remained where he was, polite, reserved, watching. Richard recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look Michael used to have, the look of someone deciding whether they could trust a promise. Inside the house, Susan was thrilled. The children filled the rooms with energy. Laughter returned to corners that had been quiet for too long. Richard found himself simply sitting and watching. Watching Lily tell stories. Watching Ethan explain a school project. Watching Susan smile. Ordinary moments. The kind he once would have missed. The kind that suddenly felt priceless. Later that afternoon, Ethan approached him. "Grandpa? Yeah?" The boy hesitated, then held out a folded piece of paper. "It's my baseball schedule." Richard took it. Games, practice dates, tournament weekends. He smiled. "Looks exciting." Ethan nodded. Then came the question. "Can you come?" Simple words. But Richard understood their weight. This wasn't really about baseball. It was about reliability, presence, trust. The boy was asking a deeper question. "Will you show up?" Richard looked directly at him. "I'll be there." Ethan nodded politely. But his expression didn't change. The boy had heard promises before. The following Saturday, Richard woke up early. The game started at 9. By 7:30, he was already dressed. Coffee in hand. Ready. Excited, even. Then his phone rang. A former board member. Richard ignored it. The phone rang again. And again. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. He answered. The situation was urgent. The company was facing another major issue. Several key clients were threatening to leave. Executives wanted advice. Investors wanted reassurance. The old world was calling him back. For nearly 20 minutes, Richard listened. As the conversation continued, he glanced at the clock. 8:15, then 8:30, then 8:40. Suddenly he felt something terrifying. The pull. The same pull that had controlled him for 30 years. The voice inside his head began speaking. "Just this once. You can still make the game. Handle the call first. Be responsible. Do both." The exact lies he had told himself thousands of times. Then he remembered Michael's birthday. The cake. The waiting. The window. Richard stood up. "I'm sorry," he interrupted. "We need to finish this later." The executive sounded shocked. "This can't wait." Richard looked at the baseball schedule hanging on his refrigerator. "Actually," he said quietly, "it can." Then he ended the call. At 8:55, Richard sat in the bleachers. 5 minutes early. He couldn't remember the last time he had arrived early for anything unrelated to work. Parents chatted around him. Kids warmed up on the field. The morning sun lit the grass. And for some reason, Richard felt nervous. Then Ethan appeared. The boy spotted him immediately. Their eyes met across the field. For a second, Ethan looked surprised, as if he genuinely hadn't expected him to come. Then something small happened. A tiny smile appeared, only for a moment. But Richard saw it, and it meant everything. Over the next several weeks, Richard kept showing up. Baseball games, school events, family dinners, weekend visits. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just consistently. One appearance at a time. One promise at a time. Slowly, something began changing. Not just in his relationships. Inside himself. He laughed more, slept better, worried less. For years he had chased success, believing it would eventually make him happy. Instead, happiness had been waiting in places he rarely visited. One evening, several months later, Susan sat beside him on the porch. The sun was setting. The sky glowed orange and gold. Richard looked peaceful, more peaceful than he had been in decades. Susan smiled. "You've changed." Richard laughed softly. "I know." "No," she said. "You really have." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Susan looked toward the yard, where Ethan and Lily were playing. "You know what makes me happiest?" "What?" She squeezed his hand. "They'll remember this version of you." Richard felt emotion rise in his chest. Not the grandfather who was always busy. Not the man constantly checking his phone. Not the stranger who missed everything. This version. Present. Available. Human. Then his phone buzzed. A message from his doctor. Richard opened it casually. But after reading the first line, his smile disappeared. His face went pale. Susan immediately noticed. "What is it?" Richard stared at the screen, unable to speak. Because the test results he had almost forgotten about contained news he never expected to hear. News that would change everything once again. Richard didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed locked on the phone screen, as if reading it again would somehow change the meaning. It didn't. Susan shifted closer. "What is it?" she asked again, quieter this time. Richard finally lowered the phone. His hand was steady, but only because he was forcing it to be. "It's the doctor," he said. Susan studied his face. That was enough for her to know this wasn't routine. "Richard, talk to me." He exhaled slowly. "They found something during the follow-up tests." A pause. Then the words came out heavier than he expected. "It's my heart." The porch fell silent. Even the sounds of the children playing in the yard felt distant now. Susan didn't react dramatically. She just looked at him, like she was trying to understand what had already been decided without her. "What kind of problem?" she asked. Richard swallowed. "A blockage." The word sounded simple, but neither of them were simple people anymore. They both knew what it meant. Risk, uncertainty, time suddenly becoming very limited. For a long moment, Susan didn't speak. Then she reached for his hand. "You're going to the hospital," she said. Richard shook his head slightly. "Not right now." "Richard," I said, "not right now." His voice was calm, but firm. For decades he had made decisions under pressure. This felt different. Not because it was more complicated. Because it wasn't about business anymore. It was about life. And strangely, he wasn't afraid of the diagnosis itself. He was afraid of timing. Of how unfair it felt that just when he finally learned how to live, time might be tightening again. Inside the house later that evening, Michael noticed immediately. "You look off," he said. Richard tried to smile. "I'm fine." Michael didn't believe him. He never had. "Dad," he said carefully. "What's going on?" There it was again. That word. Dad. Still unfamiliar in moments like this. Richard looked at his son. At the man he had once been too busy to raise properly. At the distance that had taken years to repair even slightly. Then he made a decision. "I need surgery," he said. The room went quiet. Ethan and Lily, who had been watching TV, suddenly turned. Susan stood up slowly from her chair. Michael froze. For the first time in a long time, the entire family was looking at him at once. Not as a businessman, not as an outsider, but as someone who mattered. The hospital was bright and cold in a way that made time feel slower. Richard sat in a gown, waiting. Machines beeped softly around him. A nurse adjusted his IV. Susan was beside him. Michael stood near the window. Ethan and Lily had been taken home earlier, unaware of the full seriousness. Richard preferred it that way. He didn't want fear in their eyes. Not now. Not when he had so little control over what came next. Susan squeezed his hand. "You scared me more with your work calls than this," she said softly. Richard gave a weak smile. "Fair." Michael walked over. "You should have told us earlier." Richard nodded. "I know. No excuses. No defenses. Just truth." That was new for him too. Hours later, right before surgery, a doctor entered. Everything felt sharper, clearer, final in a way that business meetings never had been. The doctor explained the procedure, risks, success rates, recovery expectations. Richard listened quietly. Then he asked one question. Not about survival, not about pain, but something else. "How long after the surgery? Before I can go home?" The doctor paused. "Assuming everything goes well, a few days." Richard nodded. That was enough. Because what mattered wasn't the hospital. It was what waited after. Before they wheeled him in, Susan leaned closer. Her voice trembled slightly. "You're not allowed to leave me now," she said. Richard smiled faintly. "That sounds like an order." "It is." He squeezed her hand. "I'll come back." A simple sentence. But this time, it didn't sound like a promise made out of habit. It sounded like something earned. The last thing Richard saw before anesthesia took him was Michael standing by the door, watching. Not distant anymore, just afraid. And for the first time, Richard realized something that surprised him. He wasn't scared of dying. He was scared of not having enough time to finish becoming the man his family deserved. The world began to fade. But one thought stayed clear. If he got out of this, he wouldn't waste a single remaining day the way he used to. Then everything went dark. Silence. That was the first thing Richard noticed when he woke up. Not the kind of silence that felt peaceful. The kind that felt earned through pain. His eyes slowly opened. White ceiling. Soft hospital light. A steady rhythm of machines beside him. Then he felt it. Pressure in his chest. Controlled and distant. Like something had been repaired but not forgotten. He tried to move his hand. It worked. That alone almost made him emotional. A nurse noticed immediately. "You're awake," she said softly, smiling. Richard nodded slowly. "Did it work?" The nurse glanced at the monitor. "Your surgery was successful." For a moment, he just stared at the ceiling. No celebration. No dramatic relief. Just quiet understanding. He had been given more time, and he didn't plan to waste it. A voice came from his left. "You scared me." "Susan?" He turned his head. She was sitting beside him. Eyes tired, but warm. Richard managed a weak smile. "You're still here." Susan raised an eyebrow. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." Behind her, Michael stood near the door. Ethan and Lily were not there this time. This moment was heavier. Adult, serious, real. Michael walked closer. "You should have told us how bad it was." Richard nodded. "I know. No defense. No excuses. Just acceptance." Michael studied him for a moment. Then said something unexpected. "I stayed the whole night." Richard blinked. "I know." "How do you know?" Susan answered quietly. "Because I stayed too." A pause. Then she added, "And I don't think either of us wanted to leave." That evening, Richard was moved into a recovery room. The kind with bigger windows. More light, less machinery. More life. Michael left to check on the kids. Susan stayed. She sat near the window while Richard rested. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Susan broke the silence. "You know what I was thinking last night?" Richard turned slightly. "What?" She looked out the window. "If you had died before this surgery." She stopped. Didn't finish the sentence immediately. Then she continued. "I don't think you would have regretted your job." Richard didn't respond. She turned back to him. "I think you would have regretted us." The honesty hit harder than pain medication ever could. Because she was right. Not completely. But enough. Enough to matter. The next morning, Michael brought coffee. Real coffee. Not hospital coffee. The gesture was small, but it felt intentional. He sat down. "I talked to the kids," he said. Richard nodded. "How are they?" Michael smiled faintly. Confused. A pause. "Ethan asked if you were okay." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "And Lily said she's making you a get better card." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Then opened them again. "I want to see them." Michael nodded immediately. "You will." No hesitation. No conditions. Just certainty. And that certainty meant more than Richard expected. 3 days later, Richard was discharged. Standing outside the hospital, he felt the air differently. Not like freedom exactly. More like awareness. As if the world had been there all along, and he was only now learning how to see it. Susan held his arm as they walked. "You okay?" she asked. Richard thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah." But after a pause, he added something more honest. "I think I'm just finally awake." Susan smiled. "About time." At home, everything felt both familiar and new. Same house, same rooms, same furniture, but different eyes looking at it. That evening, Ethan and Lily arrived. The moment they saw him, they ran. No hesitation this time. No testing. No distance. Just relief. "Grandpa." Lily hugged him tightly. Ethan followed a second later. Careful at first. Then fully. Richard closed his eyes, held them both, and realized something simple. This is what he had been chasing his whole life. Not success. Not legacy. Not achievement. This. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Richard sat on the porch. Susan joined him. The house was quiet again, but not empty. For the first time, quiet didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. Susan leaned her head on his shoulder. "So," she said softly. "What now?" Richard looked out at the dark sky. A long pause. Then he answered. "Now I don't chase anything." Susan smiled. "That sounds boring." Richard chuckled. "Good." Another pause. Then he added something quieter. "I think I finally understand. I didn't lose 30 years. Susan looked up at him. "What did you lose then?" Richard didn't hesitate. "I lost attention." He looked down at his hands. "And I finally learned how to give it back." Silence settled between them. Not heavy, not sad, just real. A life not fully repaired, but finally redirected. And somewhere inside that quiet night, Richard Bennett stopped being the man who chased success and became the man who finally came home.